History laid the foundation
that informs our conversation. Welcome to the classroom.
From the church to the streets, and even in the suites, and all around the world. I'm gonna keep it real in the classroom.
Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom.
Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Fannie Lou's Classroom. I am your host, Reverend D.A., and I'm super duper excited about our episode on today. But listen, first, if you're already watching, that means you're already connected. But make sure you tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and anybody else about Fannie Lou's Classroom. They can like us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you can be alerted when we go live. And listen, as always, I always have to shout out our Fannie Lou Classroom production team because they make sure we are tight, right, and ready to go every Thursday, 12 o'clock noon. So let me shout out our engineer, is engineer, audio, the one who holds down the Fannie Lou's Classroom, Brooke Mosley, the one and only Brooke Mosley. We want to give her a shout out. Then, of course, you know, Shanika and Cheryl hold it down every single Thursday. You know, they held it down last week as we honored the life and legacy of Dr. Irene Height. So let's give a shout out and thank Shanika and Cheryl for all they do. I will put the camera on Cheryl on purpose because we know how much she loves the camera. So thank you, team. You are the best. You make sure we have a successful podcast. And as we round out, this is close to our final episode. The last episode will air next Thursday. I want to make sure that I always publicly acknowledge all of the hard work that goes into making sure the Fannie Lou's Classroom is set and ready to go. And listen, you can support Fannie Lou's Classroom by purchasing a T-shirt. It's available if you go to friendshipwest.org/justice, and you'll see Fannie Lou's Classroom. You can purchase this shirt. This just helps us continue to do what we do to bring amazing guests to the show so we can make sure this becomes a dynamic learning community where we're learning from one another. We bring in folks to have conversations around issues that are important to you, important to our community, and more importantly, it is for the edification of the kingdom of God. So the shirt helps us do all of that. You can purchase that shirt. And, I mean, it's just lovely. Don't you agree? I mean, yes. Brooke don't like the camera either. She has her shirt on today as well. So we definitely want to make sure that you support us in any way that you can to purchase that T-shirt for Fannie Lou's Classroom. So what I want to do, I'm going to switch it up a bit. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two guests for the day. And our show today is really going to be centered and anchored around what we're saying, going back to our roots. So we certainly understand that there are very healthy, vibrant relationships between black men and black women, or not just in this country, but in the Africa diaspora. We understand that and we recognize and we honor that. I mean, I personally follow on Instagram, Black Love Exists, Black Couples. I follow anything that lifts up and edifies love of black people, period. But we also know there's also some tension that we also have. There are also some ways in which the breach has been kind of rift, right, if you will, as relates to how we interact and engage with one another. So today I want to have two people on today that I think will be wonderful to have this conversation with, to engage in some dialogue, at least get it started. There's no way we can do it all in 1 hour, but we'll do our best just to get us to thinking about how we might want to approach what does it mean for black men and black women to have healthy conversations, have healthy relationships before we even talk about romantic relationships in marriage, but talk about the ways in which we prepare the breach to be more connected with one another. So let me introduce our first guest. He's been here before. We're going to welcome him back, and that's Reverend Dameon Madison, my friend, my colleague, my brother, who is a native of Chicago. Right. Who is right, Chi-Town, and that's definitely my second home. It wasn't so cold, I would go more often. So he possesses a heart for ministry for as long as he can remember. Reared in the church, exposed to ministry at all levels, he is committed to the proclamation of the word, ministerial development and administration, and individual education and empowerment. Affectionately known as Pastor D, he has a practical approach to ministry, concerned with bridging the gap between our intellect and inspiration, passion and community problem solving, and the application of our faith and life between Sundays. Ensuing graduation, he entered the professional world and excelled far beyond the norm, so much so that he was afforded the opportunity to eventually be appointed the youngest vice president in history of his alma mater, Talladega College in Alabama, my home state. Moreover, in ministry, he has served in many capacities: organist, minister of music, chief ministry operating officer, and first assistant to the senior pastor. In recent years, he served as the pastor of stewardship and development at Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, under the leadership of our senior pastor, the Reverend Dr. Frederick D. Haynes III, where he engaged in transformative ministry, living out the call, bringing about change. That continues today as the founder and lead pastor of the Life Community Fellowship. Let's welcome back to the show my friend and my brother, Reverend Dameon Madison.
Thank you.
And then we have our very own Reverend Dr. David Malcolm McGruder. Pastor McGruder is a minister, educator, and organizer hailing from Kansas City, Kansas. His ministry, professional, and community service experience includes an array of work, from the Brisbane Institute of Political Science and Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College to the office of U.S. Senators Jerry Moran and Pat Roberts. We're going to talk about that.
That's cool. Let's talk about
that. He is a graduate of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, a proud graduate of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, where he earned a BA in political science and philosophy. He is also currently pursuing a No, you're done.
Well, that's the old one. You got the old one.
I'm like, yeah, you already a doctor.
Yeah.
Yes. So he is a graduate, right, of the University of Cambridge in the UK in history, religion, and international relations from Wolfson College at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He has several published works with his broader research interests including postmodern theology, political philosophy, and Africana studies. And today, he says he has the honor and privilege of serving as the executive pastor at Friendship West Baptist Church. And so we also have the honor and privilege of serving alongside Pastor McGruder here at Friendship West. So let's welcome him back to the classroom as well. Let's welcome back Pastor McGruder.
Thank y'all for having me.
So I've already talked to both of my colleagues here, and we're going to just be Danielle, David, and Dameon. D, and D.
See?
See?
D cubed. You know? There you go.
So we're just going to be David, Dameon, and Danielle in this conversation as we talk about how we kind of talk about this. And I know I've talked to Pastor McGruder, just both of you separately. That's why you're here together. Just in separate conversations, me and you kind of chatted up sometimes on the fly. We'll start talking about it. And individually, I've talked to you all, and you talked back to me about what we see to be somewhat problematic relationships between black men and black women, right? And of course, again, like I said at the top of the show, we know hands down there are plenty of examples of healthy, thriving relationships, and that all black folks are not at war with each other. But it's an and, not a but. And we know that a lot of us are at war with one another, right? So I thought I'd bring you both on, since I've had the individual conversation. I'm like, man, it'd be great to have both of them on, just your lens, the way in which you view that. I thought your perspectives would be amazing to have, right? So again, we're going to be oppositional. We right here together. Oppositional, right? We'll be right here together having this conversation. So I think I want to anchor it in. Let's go back, I don't know, maybe 2,000-3,000 years.
Before we do that, can I dive in one time?
Yes, please.
I want to dive in into a personal marketing moment. I want to add to that bio that recently I am the project manager for the Better Together initiative at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta. So I want to add that.
Excuse me.
I want to add that.
You can clap it up, bro. Go and put that clap on. There you
So I just
go.
want to add that. I'm sorry. So,
As a King Center alum, man, that's dope. Congratulations.
yeah,
Awesome. No, that's awesome.
Appreciate it. So,
No,
so
you need to up that. Yeah, we need to talk about that.
Yeah, so better together. No, I'm just saying.
Better
Yeah.
together.
Better
Congratulations.
come on, better together.
Yeah, it is.
So that's good. We need to know that. That's good stuff. So so I want to talk about the ways in which I think Dr. Carruthers talks about this quite often about the apposition of unity and mutuality of how it existed and what it looked like before the disruption, right? Before the Mayapha. In terms of, and I'm going to kind of anchor this in, we're closing out International Women's History Month. And let me do this as a point of privilege. To close out International Women's History Month, this is what I would like for people to do. I want you to watch 2 documentaries that are out there. One is a documentary on Polly Murray, My Name is Polly. you should watch that. That is a woman who continues, in my opinion and estimation, continues to go unnoticed, not recognized for the great gift and great mind that she had and what she contributed to this nation, including the very legal strategy that made Brown v. Board of Education possible, that victory possible. I think you should watch that documentary. And then it's the rebellious life of Miss Rosa Parks, and it's also a book by the same name by Jean Theo Harris. So I would just encourage everybody, because we think Rosa Parks, we know seamstress, sat down on the bus. No. Watch the documentary. She was so much more than that. And what I would call, many try to claim her as a feminist, I would call her a race woman, not a feminist, right? And I think to watch that documentary, that would come out in ways that most people probably never would have thought about. So that's just a point of privilege. Watch that as you round out International Women's History Month. Those 2 documentaries, and including the book, if you're able to get the book, read that book. Because I think what it lends itself to also, when we think about those movements, that we did not see that unity in terms of acknowledging the work that the women put into the movement. Right, we talked about Dr. Height last week, how she was the closest person to King on that platform, that Have a Dream speech. And though she had all of what she had everything possible you could, if you want to do a checklist, was she capable of standing up speaking? She had it all and was never asked to speak. Right, so for me, I want to go back to a time when I think there was no separation, where there was no hierarchy in terms of how we view one another. Right, and so I want to read something that Dr. Carruthers wrote in an article when she talks about women in their roles in African society, right? So she says, an ancient Egyptian law attests to the independent, non-oppressive status of African women. A married woman kept her independent status, including her family name. Women sat on tribunals, witnessed documents, inherited and sold property, and could have independent income as a matter of right and responsibility. Women were given equal rewards for their labor. Sexuality was not an issue for access of occupations, education, and the courts. Nonetheless, there were separate male occupations and female occupations in addition to those in which both could participate, right? So I think we think about kinship, we think about queen motherhood in Africa. There was never this battle, right? There was never this this notion of one is the head and one is submissive to the other, as it existed then, right? And so I want to just talk about just either one of you can answer this question. What is your understanding of how we were prior to the Great Disruption, our Alpha, and then we'll kind of go into what that means today. Your understanding of how we existed prior to coming to America, how we saw one another, and I'll even talk about it so much as when we think about the Queen Warriors, right? The way in which they really led in battle. And I think about 2 people. I think about Ya Asatawa, right? Who, when they had the European War for the Golden Stool, when the Europeans wanted the Golden Stool for its value, that the Ashanti were like, no, this is not just about gold for us. This is sacred for us. And then when the men began to negotiate behind the scenes how we might go ahead and let the Europeans have this golden stool, Ya Asatawa said, if this is what you're going to do, I'll go to war to ensure this golden stool does not, be captured by the Europeans. And eventually, she went to war, et cetera, and was then exiled to the island of Seychelles. And if you want to put Bible in it, we go to Judges 4 with Deborah and Barak, right? Where he was like, hey, I'll go if you go.
Right.
And she's like, well, you won't be getting the credit if I have to go down there and handle the business. We know she handled the business, right? So I think we have a history of showing, even in the Bible, where women certainly had very prominent roles and it was not this hierarchy. And so what is your understanding of how we were prior to the Maafa?
Oh, go ahead. Go at it.
I think one of the things that we have to divorce ourselves from, and even trying to approach this conversation and even look at how we were, is to not look at things as they are. And even when we look at scripture, you mentioned, Deborah and Deborah and others, and even down to Jezebel, right? Like, we have painted her theologically as a whore.
Right.
But looking at her contextually, she was a beast. Like, she was a master when it comes to strategy and logistics. And she was able to do things that men couldn't do in that time. And so even when you look at that, it shows us that how we arrive at the place now is a very misogynistic depiction of womanhood. And so going back to even before the breach, before the disruption, before colonization, we didn't have the contention. Now, again, it varied by tribe.
Right.
It varied by locale. And it's very contextual, but by and large, women were the bearers of intellectuality. Women were the bearers of strategy and defense. Women were the bearers. I mean, and so even looking at, many women made decisions that men followed in various tribes. And so I think what we arrive at now is really a place and space where we're living in the oppressive environment that came out of colonization, where we see women as less than, and that shows up even in the text, which is oftentimes, again, is very poorly translated, and very poorly articulated even. It's this idea of hierarchy and headship and control, and which is really sexism and misogyny. And so we things as they are not as they were in many spaces prior to colonization.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that it is important for, as Brother Dameon said, to understand the ways in which various tribes, various groups of people kind of organize their societies, and there are differences. So I think it's important, to your point, for us to highlight, again, those societies where there's a sort of matrilineality and matrifocality, where women were given great leadership responsibilities. And I think it's also important for us to identify that I think the key word for me is, in terms of how we organize and how we related to one another in the past, the key word is mutuality. But I also think it's important to understand that mutuality didn't necessarily lend itself to a sameness, right?
Right.
That mutuality produced, that there was a mutuality that at the same time produced a respect for the differences. The men didn't give birth, right? And
right.
There were, as you said, there were sort of male tasks defined in Egypt. So there's a need for, I think, in terms of how we talk about the historical treatment of male-female relationships, I think that's important to talk about mutuality and the ways in which that mutuality also respected difference.
Right.
Right. And I
sure.
think that part of it's too tempting to not touch on how we see things today.
We
so
get
my,
there.
Yeah. So my point is not because I don't want to be out of order, is I think it's important for us to recognize that difference does not mean deficiency.
Right.
Right. And how do we develop and articulate a sense of mutuality that has a respect for the ways in which we're different. Right.
For sure.
And at the same time respects the kind of inherent value that men and women both have in the sight of God, and therefore in the sight of each other. So I think that the key word for how we treat the African past, the relationship between black men and black women in the African past, I think that key word is mutuality.
For sure.
And kind of articulating and teasing out what that means. Right.
Yeah, I think mutuality and I think harmony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Those are two ways in which I think we situate and reflect on that. Still. And to your point, that obviously, we know just in now present day Ghana, which was then, right, the Ashanti Kingdom, which was wide and vast. Right. You had, to your point, many different tribes, but there was a common theme throughout many African, tribes, and the way in which they organized and understood one another, to your point, was still centered around mutuality and harmony, and how they did that, right? Yeah. And so let's talk then about if that's where we came from, because now I think in some of you, if you've been to Africa, you kind of can see the shift in that and how they definitely have mimicked, westernized way of understanding family structure, as well as men. And I know when I went to, it wasn't Kumasi, when I went to Brazzaville in the Congo. I mean, I get just my own experience being a part of the sect of the church, that the church there split. So not knowing I was then with the conservative side of the church. When I arrived with all my bags and my clothes for 2.5 weeks, I never wore those clothes because every day they brought me a uniform to put on. And my skirt had to come all the way past my ankle. And if it's so much to show any part of my leg, a mother would come over and pull it down. Right, so I recognize back then I didn't know the connection, right? But the more I learned, I was like, I saw what was happening, right? That they had completely divorced themselves from understanding what it meant by way of body, how we viewed the body, and what it meant for women to be completely covered and dressed up and against how the men walked around. And even how we were situated in church where we had to sit and the way you had to move and be. So it was like a crash course for me, almost like an on-the-job training to make sure I didn't do anything that offended.
Right.
So I was every woman, only the women were assigned a mother. And that one was with me from the time I got there to the time I left. Yeah. And I just, we went to, guess it was Kumasi, and there was it was a tomb, which was also their shrine of their founder. So the question was asked for the women, who in here is menstruating, right? So two of us were, and it's like, well, you can't go. You all have to stay here. You can't walk on the grounds because that's going to taint the sacred space. Right? So, I'm definitely Americanized, but I'm also at the same time, have been coming into, under the tutelage of Dr. C, just in terms of what did it mean to be, Black and Christian in the world, but also African, right? So I'm thinking this is some wild stuff. Now, a whole lot of stuff happened, but that was just some of the things. And as I think about how, to your point, colonization has impacted that, even that process in Africa, that has even changed. But that's why I want to go further back before the Europeans navigated the waters and found their way there, what life was like.
Yeah. I think we oftentimes underestimate the amount of shame and shaming that came with colonization. The fact that, and especially as it comes to, as relates to the female body, right? The fact that there's something wrong with how God made you. There's something, to use your word, deficient or dysfunctional about how God made you. And the level of oppression that comes with that, right? And, so the fact that, before colonization, before the disruption, we saw God in everything.
Right.
We saw God in how God created us. And even if we look at even the over-sexualization of the female body we see now was not present then, and we honored and respected the female body. You could walk around with your breast in the open.
That's right.
And you better not touch them.
Better not, right.
Because you're going to honor and respect that person.
Right.
And so I think the shame that came with colonization, the oppression that came with colonization, also came with it a toxic perspective of the woman. And so again, she's lesser than, there's something inherently wrong with her. To your point, the whole idea of menstruation, that you can somehow cause some disruption in sacred ground because you're doing what God created you to do anyway, which is very, it's a paradox, right? It's like, you're dysfunctional in the way that God made you. And so out of that is a huge amount of noise that is really born out of the objective of demonizing an entire people.
Right.
And I don't think we recognize that we've embraced much of that demonization, and we made it doctrine.
Exactly.
And so,
Exactly.
Yeah, now as you were talking, it made me think about one of my favorite books from my Morehouse days, a book by the name of Imperial Leather by Anne McClintock. You read it? Yeah. So as you were talking, it made me think about the ways in which cartographers in the early modern period, as they were preparing to kind of go out and subjugate the lands, the ways in which they would represent the land as these kind of indigenous women. That the bodies, like mountains, right, became like equivalent with breasts, right, and so forth and so on. So there was a way in which the cartographers were attempting to kind of read onto the land and to the Black female body simultaneously, right, a rendering of both as a sort of site of conquest. So I think that's important to kind of keep in mind as we're talking about this, right, that why would why would we move from a time where the female body was respected to a time where it's sort of seen as something that we got to cover up and hide and hinder? Well, that's a function of the fact that, right, as a consequence of colonization, the Black female body and the land, right, itself were seen as sites of conquest. And I think that's super important. I think that's super important.
That's good. That's a good point. That's a good pivot to make because now I want to turn to because I mean I know a lot happened once Europeans found their way to to Africa. So let's talk about then how we have over time, right, began to mimic that Western way of knowing and being as relates to how we see ourselves and how we interact with one another. One of the things I talked about the other day, for example, was we were relating this to Black maternal mortality morbidity rates, that this is not new, that this is just a different iteration in 2023. We go back where the womb was seen as for labor and productivity during enslavement. It was also conquest too, right? Because it was this notion of I can also rape you whenever I wanted to for my pleasure, not even for reproduction. It's just this what I want right now, right? Where her body was no longer her own. And so let's talk about how, and however you want to start off and kind of dive into it. I know we're skipping a whole lot in between, but I want to at least kind of anchor the conversation, understanding we have not always been this way. This has not always been our way of knowing and being, and something disrupted that.
Yeah.
And so now I feel like in many ways it's so deeply embedded, and to your point, it's also deeply embedded in our theology. And so how do we kind of break free from that? But talk about the ways in which the disruption began to unravel, in my opinion, how because our ancestors who came over on those boats brought that type of way of knowing with them. And we know there was a seasoning, if you will, that took place. So let's just talk about what those disruptors are so we can then talk about how do we kind of repair, do the restoration and the repair. We got to return to it first and remember in order to move forward.
Well, sure. Angela Davis writes about this in the Black woman's role in the community of slaves. Again, one of my another favorite essay of mine. And her kind of point is that the slave experience, in her mind, sort of places a kind of egalitarian ceiling on both the Black man and the Black woman. Essentially, like we came here together, having kind of a similar experience, different, right? There is a difference, right? There's that word again, even in how we experienced slavery. But we came here sort of together, having this experience of slavery together. And I think that in a strange way, that togetherness has been, in a way, it was weaponized against us in a way, right? And then we have sort of used that as a bludgeon against one another, right? To avoid, for Black men, I think, what does it mean for how about I say it like this? We understand what it is for the Black woman's body and the land of our ancestors to be seen as a site of conquest. But then what does it mean for the psyche of the Black man to be a site of conquest, to have to go through that and experience the loss of land, right? The inability to protect your woman from the experience of violation. So what does that do to like I said, to the psyche of Black people, of Black men in particular, right? As a site of in kind of converting their psyches as into a site of conquest, right? Yeah. So I think that's really what we're fighting against. That's really what we're fighting against. It is a war against a deeper kind of psychic colonization. Yes. And so the effort is to redeem the Black male and Black female mind from this crisis, right? Because we're in it, as Angela says, we're in this thing together. Right. And I think that's where I think that's where a lot of the war is, the current war that we're experiencing right now is we're in it together and we don't want to be together, right? We're trying to figure out how we can, brother want a white woman, sister want to figure out how she can get her little, vanilla sugar daddy, and we're trying to run away from each other, right? Instead of recognizing the fact that we have come here in this boat together, right? So, I'll speak sort of from my experience, as a millennial, right, watching how the internet has become sort of the battleground, the primary battleground for these wars, right, against one another, where we're literally, using YouTube and, Instagram and all these other technologies to drive ourselves further and further apart. And the crisis is, this is the time when we need to be coming together the most, and we like each other the least, right? And we are forgetting that we came here together, and so that our survival is knitted together. That's right. And so how do we then revive a sense of mutuality that respects, again, like I'm saying, difference, in light of, again, the myriad of ways in which we have evolved as a people. That's right. Even being in the American context, you take a wolf, out of captivity, You know, and he or she become domesticated. So there's a change even in the orientation of the wolf, of the lion, so forth and so on. So we've got to realize that our survival in this context is predicated upon our ability to remain together and to sort of think that through in light of the ways in which we have indeed evolved. Yeah. Like, we got to keep it real. You know, many of the sisters today are proud to say, you know, I'm not my grandmother. Right? So we've evolved. And brothers today recognize that they ain't their grandfathers, right? We've evolved. So how do we stay together? How do we hold on to each other and do that again in a way that acknowledges, you know, the inherent value in one and another? Right,
real talk. And I think that, to add to that, I mean, I love everything you said. And you mentioned the whole piece about the psyche, right? Yeah. I think one of the things that we don't just talk enough about, and Paulo Freire talks about this in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? The fact that one of the things that we have done as an oppressed people, that we have begun to emulate oppression as a means of obtaining power, you know, and our idea of success and control and status, what have you. And so we have, in many ways, emulated and replicated oppression, even in relationship.
That's right.
And it even shows up in our theology, even, right? You know, and so what happens is we're replicating dysfunction with the hope of arriving at normalcy.
Sure.
And so, in that space, we are functioning broken. That's right. And so, and functioning broken, we have become we worship control as a means of how we function in relationship, right? Sure. And so, and then you take that and go further, you know, to your point about, again, how we grow and we change and we evolve over time. We tend to view self and others very monolithically. Right, as if,
which is antithetical to who we are as a people.
Exactly. And so all this stuff, all this noise in the space, we still don't see ourselves, don't know ourselves enough to even interrelate with somebody else, because we are functioning in the dysfunction, the toxicity of oppression. Yeah. And we won't confront it.
But let's keep it real. Colonization, the experience of oppression is a crisis.
Absolutely.
And people function dysfunctionally in crisis, right? So I think that's part of it too. And I think there's an effort for us to see it as something other than that. Right. We want to normalize. To your point, right? We're trying to operate in dysfunction in order to generate a sense of normalcy. So how do we? I guess this is a question. Yeah, how do we get to a place, right, where we're reminded that, hey, no matter how well we're doing, financially. You get what I'm saying? No matter how our sisters progress in terms of education and access to jobs, no matter, you know what I'm saying, what brothers are doing in terms of entrepreneurship, so forth and so on, that we're still in the midst of a real crisis.
Yeah, well, I think part of it, though, right, is this, because what you're all saying, colonization, how we mimic, you know, Francis Fanon talks about that, right, in terms of once colonizers left many of the Caribbean nations, the same processes remain, because all they did was mimic what was done to them, right? It's that whole notion of we become that which we detest. And I think that's what we see in relationships. And I think we have adopted certainly the Western way of understanding relationships. And because Dr. Crothers writes about the attack on African familyhood, and she talks about the ways in which African people over time, as Europeans came into the continent in various tribes, how they began to then mimic and understand themselves in a Western lens and no longer in their African lens. So it's no longer Ubuntu. Right? It's no longer Salbona. So to your point, we're in a crisis. Well, we don't want to even, so some of us, or as Bobby Wright would say, we're victims of menticide.
Right, or real talk.
You know, so the question becomes, how do we first, it starts here first. And it kind of goes back to when we talk about the soul trauma. And, you know, you've read a lot about this in terms of how the trauma of our ancestors has been passed on to us.
Right. Epigenetics.
Thank you. Epigenetics. That's the word I was looking for. And that's real. And so I'm saying somewhere we have to say, and this may lend itself to what we may be talking about, where does the church fit in this, situate itself and how we repair this, right? Because some of this has to be, you got to deal with the dysfunctionality that we all are in. And so it's funny when I know you were telling about, I can't remember who, it was a YouTube channel you pointed me to about women, black women who were saying,
I forgot, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I didn't. I was so traumatized. I put it out of my mind. I forgot all about it. But I remember what you. I remember.
But because it was wild, right?
It was wild,
Just
wasn't it?
in terms of how even because this is what I saw that and I was like, I've never heard of black women like, don't fool with black men. You need to make sure you leave that alone. Get you an Asian or what?
Yeah.
This very point. But
Very
when I
point.
go with something like Shade Room, and I'm going through comments.
Mm-hmm.
I consistently hear black men. That's why we don't date y'all. That's why we don't marry y'all.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we don't like you. I'm like, oh my God, we hate each other.
Yeah.
Well, see,
So let's switch. I'll go ahead because you ready because I know where I'm going next. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, but what we see there is how relationship has been commodified. And that's the piece that we don't talk about, right? The fact that because of oppression, because of urbanization, we view relationship even through the lens of commodification. Like, if you can't buy this for me, if you can't do this for me, if there isn't some benefit economically, I'm not going to fool with you.
That's deep.
And so again, but we don't tie that. We don't look at where that comes from.
Right.
Sorry,
No, that's
Can I get in there though? Because I think that's really good.
Absolutely.
And I think, let me get in there. Not that I'm got enough money to have this conversation, but
me either. And I'm married.
how about you married? But here's the point. I think we benefit when we can have that honest conversation.
That's right.
When we can have that conversation and where we can talk. Again, it goes back to the term mutuality. We got to see how we mutually are harming one another. Right. And what we tend to do is we tend to only see, hey, my side, all the sisters want is the money, right? And the sisters from their side are seeing.
All the men want this body. Why you think you
Yeah.
have this excess of plastic surgery?
Right.
Black women literally risking their life
Right.
Come on.
to get BBLs.
Right.
To look
Yeah.
good on Instagram.
You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Why? Because what men pay for OnlyFans, well, women too, but that drives men.
We can talk about that.
And
We
Instagram
got to talk about it.
and Instagram models, they not doing that just for them.
It's the slave auction.
It is.
It's a sexual
in
slave
21st
auction.
century,
100%.
in 2023. And
Sexual slave
And
auction.
how do we connect those dots so people can see what it is?
Yeah.
Because I know we're up against a machine in terms
Oh, yeah.
of, narrative.
Oh, yeah.
Because they'll quick tell you, well, that's, and I definitely feel myself to be a liberated black woman. But what I was told from somebody else was, that's that woman's body, and she has the right to use that to make her money. Yeah, but right, I think there's a but there, right? And I think that because I'm saying the risk that women are taking
Right.
for that.
Yeah.
That for me is problematic.
What did he say though? It's commodification.
It's
the deep commodification.
I mean, you might as well be back on the plantation.
That's what I'm saying.
On the block.
Yeah, it's on the auction block.
Just
It's the
stand on the
auction
block.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I'm gonna get in trouble for this one. And right here,
It just got real.
He can look at
Bomb drop sound effect.
right here is where we really don't want to walk.
Yep.
Here it is.
go ahead and walk. That's why we're here.
You opened the door about the role of the church.
Yes, yes.
The reason why the church won't even address this issue is because of commodification. The church makes money off of misogyny. The church makes money off of sexism. I mean, real talk. I mean, all these books that we have about purity culture. I mean, all the books that we have about, again, about women, being in your role. I mean, that book, Jesus and John Wayne, I talked about.
Right,
What's it
right.
called?
Jesus and John
Jesus
Wayne.
John
Jesus and John.
Wayne.
Okay, I have heard of that. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
And it outlines how they had women to write curriculum on how to make sure you lived, appreciated, walked in, and honored your subjugation. This is how you look because your husband wants you to look this way. This is how you function. And so it happens, we've created an entire economy
Yeah.
out of female subjugation and oppression. And here it is. And we can't mess up our offerings and our systems because, again, that's how we have grown up theologically in many spaces. And again, and even though much of that came from a white evangelical space, we have many black churches who are evangelical with black face. And so in that space, we are creating economy out of making sure that women are subjugated, and it's hard to repair a breach when you make money off of it.
David.
Don't be looking at me. I mean, that's right. I think it's right. At the same time, I wonder. I've been sort of toying with this idea of theological realism. You heard it here first on Fannie Lou's
Come
Classroom.
on now, Fannie Lou's Classroom.
But I mean, yeah, how do we move beyond our kind of ideological desire to really dealing in the world theologically, sociologically, existentially in the world as it really is, right? So, you know, I don't have an answer for it. I think, you know, Dameon's right? That is kind of that's where we are. I don't know a way forward, right? I mean, that's why we're here to kind of talk it through. I don't know a way forward because, from my understanding, as many women have bought into it as men.
Right.
Well, absolutely, absolutely.
So-
I mean, most of what I catch comes from women. I mean, same thing with black folks. Just like you can internalize oppression, you can internalize patriarchy, misogyny. You know, you become a purveyor of it too. Absolutely, and it's an interesting space to be in when you encounter that. And so I'm not saying it's easy, but I am saying when you put that up against laws, policies,
Right.
our communities failing, we're not going to survive if we continue to have that mutuality of dislike.
Yeah, mutual dislike versus mutual appreciation. Yeah.
It's not going, and we're not seeing where and it goes back to because we're seeing ourselves as individualistic.
Yeah.
It's okay to be an individual because, as you said it, Dr. Wright says it, different doesn't mean deficit. We're individuals. God made us uniquely individual, but it's the individualism that gets us.
Right.
And that's where we are. We can't tear away from that Western way of thinking that it's about me, not the Ubuntu.
Right. Right. You know, we
So-
have. I'm sorry.
No,
I
go
can cut
ahead.
you off.
No, go ahead.
please, Nick.
Go ahead.
You know, I think that to your point, and you just said something very profound, is that we have to really untether ourselves
Yeah.
from a Europeanized way of
That's
thinking
right.
and theology.
That's right.
You know, and I think right in that space is I think where we can begin that process of even trying to explore and even try to get there. It's like there's some stuff that we have to untether ourselves from.
That's right.
You know, there are some ways of functioning and thinking we have to disconnect ourselves from. And part of that is even having the opportunity to reconnect with who we are as a people, right? And so I think that, and part of the difficulty in that is that we have so normalized Europeanization in Black culture that to even have a discussion, to your point about how much of the flack you get would be from women and from Black folk, is how much Black folk hate Blackness.
Oh yeah, anti-Blackness goes both ways.
And so when
Yeah.
when you enter that space in conversation, it's kind of difficult to talk about community in that in that sense because I don't like it because I've been trained and programmed socially not to like it. I've been taught theologically, and I won't say that, but I've been taught theologically not to like it, right? And so I'm having to wrestle with the fact of I don't like who I am.
Yeah.
And so if I don't like who I am,
Yeah, sure can't
I
like
can't
who
like
you are.
you because
That's
you
right.
are a reflection of who I am.
That's right.
And so it's a whole lot of brokenness and dysfunction and woundedness and also poor theology that we got to wrestle through.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like who I am, and I don't have the bandwidth to sit down to actually do the work to learn.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the crisis of the social media generation, right? Of the Twitter consciousness, right? Anything longer than 160
That's right.
characters,
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not interested in it, right? So we're in a real crisis point because,
Right.
to your point, the intellectual work that it would take to actually undo and untangle those knots of Eurocentrism and Europhilic tendencies. I mean, it would take too long and it would be too much work, and people don't have the bandwidth, right, to kind of sit and do that hard labor unless you first kind of prick their hearts and convert the heart.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so what role, now, I think in terms of Friendship West, like I say, we're already
Right.
doing it just by being in the classroom today,
I was
right?
gonna say that.
And so, but I still want to talk about, because I don't want to let the black church off the hook. Because it's also challenging churches to say that this is a step we have to take.
Yeah.
And so while some may not have the intellectual capacity, the time, the space to do that, there's some practical ways in which we have to find the ways to approach this for the masses of people, when you have them sitting there on a Sunday morning, where you have access to people, right? And especially if you're a church within community too, and you can reach community. What are some of the creative people? We innovative and creative all the time when we want to be. So what can we do to at least begin to have a conversation?
Yeah.
More broadly than this, because I just, the more I see every single day, I Cheryl and Shanika probably tell you some days I sit back, I'm like, we might not make it out of this thing because it's going so far.
Yeah.
And while we're over here not being anti-black with one another, they're over here in terms of power is continue to be amassed by the dominant culture
Yeah, real talk.
with bills and laws in place. And we all know you can't just say, oh, that happened to us, let's go change that law. Tomorrow, it doesn't happen like that. That can impact you 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I'm saying there's work to do because if you look at the last 55 years, I mean, watershed legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, we still talk about the same thing in 20 because it's also a heart issue, right? Some of this is heart to heart work, but then some of it is we have to do what we are able to. And we don't have to go back to Africa. Let's go back to Tulsa, Greenwood, like black communities and that were very much self-contained. Right, and you had like the black couple in Tulsa who had the confectionery. They had they had like several businesses, but the woman owned all the movie theaters. Right, and Pastor mentioned, I was so excited he mentioned Biddy Mason on the other Sunday. A lot of people know about Biddy Mason. This is a formerly enslaved black woman who bought land, a lot of land, church, the first church there in LA. So I think we have to find ways that we can just begin to talk. Because for some people, it's going to be they got to unravel their own trauma. Because a lot of times when you say what you don't like and on the outside, you seem to have all this confidence. You seem to be self-presenting, public-facing as you got it together, right? And that I love myself. That's why I do this. And we start digging some deeper, you don't. Right. So it's also, and I know people don't want to deal with that too. That's another, kind of roadblock we have too, right? That it's hard to sit down and say, this is where I've been wounded.
I think it begins with creating sites, first of all, where we can have the discourse, we can have the dialogue. So we need Fannie Lou's Classroom. Brooke, give us a round of applause for Fannie Lou's Classroom one time in the midst of this. Yeah, we need Fannie Lou's Classroom. I also think we also need spaces for accountability. And so how do, we need spaces for black men to hold each other accountable, right? We also need spaces for the sisters to hold each other accountable, right, in terms of how we deal, how we move. And I think that's critical. I think that's critical above everything else is, where are the sites where we are, holding one another to account and saying, hey, this behavior,
right,
is unacceptable. And then do we have enough courage, right, in light of do we have enough courage to sort of set in stone what our standards are going to be as a community? So you can't be a community if you don't have boundaries. Right. And those, we think about boundaries in the geopolitical context, it's right, the boundaries of nation states.
Right.
But when we're talking about, among a people, we're talking about the boundaries of culture and what our practices are and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And do we have the courage to articulate that based on where we are now? You know what I'm saying?
Right. So I think, but to your point, that is where you have which we're doing now. Actually, it is a Sankofa moment. I think it begins with going back and fetching which is beneficial back there.
Correct.
Right.
And to your point, then what does that look like in the 21st? What is it like in 2023 in the very real social, political context where we are? But I think it's some stuff back there that can work right here in 2023 because some stuff is just universal. Some stuff is just the way in which I feel God has designed and desired for humanity to flourish. It's just some common things that we ought to be able to have some boundaries that stretch across time and space, right? So, but then it becomes, okay, it's almost like a code of conduct, right?
Exactly.
Of how we're going to be with one another. Exactly. Then to your point, where's the accountability? Where does that land? Because somewhere in here, because back in African culture, you did something out of order. You went before the people. You went before the village.
Right. That's all.
Right. You were held accountable for your actions.
That's right.
Yeah. Sales pitch, and that's actually my role at King Center. That's what's called the Better Together Initiative. And it's really, the objective is to reach out to churches, the faith community, to have these conversations using the Kingian philosophy on how we create this environment centered in love, right? So that's no sales pitch. to his point earlier, also creating spaces of accountability and conversation, and then to your point about the church, that's why. And I did this. I stopped my church full stop, and and because we had to stop and restructure and reorganize to reflect who we said we were.
Right.
And so part of that is being able to connect back with that sense of African community and blackness, and start there, and begin to repair and reflect and say, wait a minute, there's some stuff that we had we kind of unplugged from that we need to kind of replug into to help us thrive and live and survive where we are now, because the context that we're living in is unhealthy for us to even try to even breathe in blackness.
Right.
That's
right.
And so I think, and that will help us in terms of having the conversation spaces and the accountability spaces about relationship, about interaction, is to one, begin to see yourself in a healthy way.
Right.
We don't see ourselves healthy.
We don't.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and sometimes we just break it down in real practical terms, and that's if somebody came to your house and stole your stuff at your house, would you try to go get it back?
Right.
And so it's that somebody stole your stuff. Your ancestors didn't come here with blank slates. They came here with fully well-formed language, culture, et cetera, right? So why wouldn't you want to go back and claim that which is yours? Because it was systematically and intentionally stripped away from you.
Yeah, but talk.
So how do we go back and have that same tenacity of somebody took your personal, because that's personal too. That should be personal to you. But to your point, a lot of people don't want to be African.
No.
Nope.
Let alone black.
No.
And I think we can see the benefit of seeing yourself as part of the diaspora. You begin to see that you're so much more than what they tell you here in America. And to your point, that we get not these borders, these man-made borders that we kind of look at are not just the physical, but it's the mental, right?
Correct.
Borders that we have placed.
Correct.
And I think we just have to want to be, but that's internal work.
Yeah.
Why? Because I have plenty of my friends like, we ain't African. Okay.
Yeah.
So it is a hard place to have that conversation just off the cuff, right? Because I can say only so much when we're just having this general conversation. But I have friends who say it, like, why you go over there? You ain't African. I'm like, yeah, I am, and you are too. Right. So let's talk, because you said something. This is kind of where I want to kind of move to this, because you said how we go back to that which we were by way of African, right? So marry that with and talk to us, both of you talk to us about not seeing that as not being spiritual. Because see, some people look at Africa and say that was with how we originally practiced and understood who God was is demonic. Right, because I think we want to talk about what are some of the spiritual foundations of a healthy relationship, and marry that with, if we go back to understand that this is God, right? That our ancestors understood and knew God, who God was, a very well-developed, informed way of that. Because I think when you say go back, some are thinking, because sometimes people say they're not African, not this and that, because how they understand that from a European lens of what is evil, is not godly, is anti-Christian.
Right. First thing we got to look at the fact that everything African is not pagan.
Right.
Everything African is not demonic. Everything African is not. Colonization painted a very poor picture of who we are, and because of that, we ourselves look at African spirituality as if there's something wrong with it. It's negative. It's demonic. It's sinful. It is. We got to move past that noise and one, be in a space where we can be taught and have the conversations about our African spirituality and recognize that, again, there's a whole lot that we have that has been demonized and stripped that we actually need.
Well, and let me say this point. When you look at, his names escape me right now, but the book is How Africa and Africans Shaped the Atlantic World. And he did a good job of really unpacking the ways in which when Europeans finally made their way into the western coast of Africa, how really when the Europeans came, it was an exchange of how the African and the European understood who God was. Mm-hmm. They were having an exchange. And it wasn't until the Europeans decided they wanted to then conquest and conquer the Africans, they began to put that into books to say, oh, if you do this, this ain't godly, that's demonic. Right. Because initially they didn't see it that way. Right. But for the benefit of, like you said, you were David, the commodification, right? Mm-hmm. It came about money and greed. So therefore, we begin to demonize that which they were saying was evil. In Africa, like, what you mean? We were just having this dialogue and conversation. Now, all of a sudden, you put in this book, and you're saying if it's beyond this, it's not godly. And it's not, and what you're doing by way of Africa is evil and demonic. Then you look at Hollywood, how they took voodoo. So when people think about voodoo, it's always dark, right? It's always, these evil spirits. And it's just how do we, and I know it takes a lot for people to have a lot of those assumptions challenged, right? Because for so long you have understood what it meant to know who God was, except in a one particular way. And I'm telling you, I've been to places around this world, and I talk to people, and I look at them, and I walk away. I'm like, I don't care what nobody say. I know that them folks knew who God was. You know what I'm saying? So I think we have to. But when you said, I just wanted to make that point that that's the other crazy part. Initially, that wasn't the case. It was just an exchange. They were exchanging in that space. Were you going to say something?
Well, no, I was just listening and kind of reflecting on the fact that people, before we can really understand our African nature or our African sort of past, we got to understand the history of Christianity.
Right.
You get what I'm saying? And most of us are not prepared to sort of think through that, the evilness of that. You get what I'm saying? Of the ways in which Christianity was imposed on black people, and the evils that were legitimated right by the Christian church. So I think that's important to the work. That's as important to the work as anything else. And the next thing, I think we might have talked about this before here, is understanding the African roots of Christianity, and understanding Christianity as an African religion.
That's right.
And so that as we understand ourselves as an African people. But then, I think this is a worldwide crisis.
Oh yes, for sure.
It's a global crisis that we're dealing with. We should come back and circle back and talk not just about the division between black men and black women. We should talk about the division between migrant communities, migrant communities of Africans and American, Africans in America.
That's a whole nother,
I've heard, migrants, say that they work harder than black people, and then white people who use that as a way, you know what I'm saying, to kind of create dissension and animosity between those two groups. So we're dealing on a war front where we have no allies. And we don't understand that.
That's right.
We don't have any
Come
allies
on.
except each other.
Come on.
But because we don't understand that, we deal so poorly with one another.
That's it.
So I think that's the full circle in a relationship context.
Yeah.
Is that for black men and black women, we don't understand that we're on this battlefield and that we have no allies.
We do not.
We have no allies. But at the same time, right, many of if you look in various areas, right, you see folks, there's an attempt at allyship with white feminists, right? There's an attempt at allyship with what do they call them? Men's rights activists on the part of black men, right? So we're doing all of this work, bifurcating our energies and efforts, because our effort and our attempt is to have allyship without realizing that we don't have no allies except each other.
Except each other.
We don't have no allies except each other.
And I'll say this and I'm going to come to you. Chancellor Williams, in his book, Destruction of Black Civilization, said this: European nations will war against one another. They will step over their own mother to get what they want. But when an outside force is seen as a threat, they band together.
You were the first outside force.
the
outside threat. The black person.
And fight off. But to your point, when we need to see that's what I'm talking about. And understanding ourselves as being part of this diasporic community. To your point, because Europeans it's us against everybody else.
That's right.
They're not trying to say I have, an ally. They ain't doing all that. They no, it's us. You see what I'm saying? And I think hospitality, and Dr. Cruz talks about, I like how she just talks about how as Africans, to your point, how we have always been hospitable and we always invite people to dine at our tables, and it's been to our detriment.
That's right. That's right.
And it's still to our detriment.
That's right.
So, but we'll get into all that because some of that also has to do with we look for money from people to fund our efforts. Because we don't want to give people money because we think everybody going to take our money. Or I don't see the value in giving you $10 a month for a 501c4 that you have that builds political power.
Right.
Because I'm not getting something immediately from it. But it's not for you to get something from it. It's to build up so your community, your child's community, your children's children can have something when they come into this world, right? So Cheryl said I have 1 minute. So Reverend Madison, say what you're going to say last, and we're going to close this thing. We're going to do it part 2 in season 3. We're coming back.
Part 2.
All I was going to say is, just the idea of thinking we have allies. At the core of it is we still are seeking and looking for affirmation and acceptance by a culture that don't like us.
That's right.
Period.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm done.
That's a good place to pause, because we're going to come back, because you are so right. We have to deal with just the internal battle we have as Africans in America, in U.S., because, it's 3 Americas.
Right.
Because to your point, we're going to talk about what that means with our brothers and sisters in the Central America, South America, Brazil in particular. So I think you're right. We need to talk about the larger issue that we have in the diasporic community in terms of this battle that we are in with one another, and it's all rooted in whiteness. It's all rooted in the way the white man has colonized this world.
Yeah. Right.
And we're still falling, prey to what has happened to us, as opposed to saying, oh, no, because that's the last thing they want. Fred Hampton, when he started talking about all that yellow power, white power, they're like, oh, no, wait a minute.
Right.
We can't do all that. So thank you, Pastor McGruder. Thank you, Pastor Madison.
Thank you.
This has been good. A lot of nuggets here, and a lot of places people can pick up a million things you said today and go down a rabbit hole, and to begin to unravel and begin to really connect to their African identity, right? And understanding what it means to live in their fullness of who God has, designed and desired for them to be. So I think we definitely going to have a part 2 and come back. We'll pick up on this, but definitely talk about that. To your point, this because I've experienced that firsthand. It was told to my face, right? About what black people, that we lazy and trifling. We got all this opportunity in America, and we have done nothing with it. So
from an African?
Yes.
From African? From our brothers and sisters.
Yes. I was like, say what, man? I don't have time to unpack that right now. But it caught me off guard, right?
And what we may discover, to the point that I think both of y'all made about the nature of colonization on the continent.
Yeah.
Here's what's going to be interesting is when we find that the salvation for black people globally and worldwide is going to come from black folk in the Americas who've been able to, at some level, right, preserve maybe not our sort of pure African blood per se, right?
Right.
But a sense of who we are as a people in pursuit of freedom and liberation.
Yeah.
That's going to be interesting.
For sure. I mean, you pick up on those retentions that we have.
There you go.
Right. And we've always done synchronization.
Right.
So we've always evolved.
That's right.
Things are always evolving. So we're not running away from it. We're just taking that which we know is beneficial.
Sure.
And how do we consistently use God to kind of lead and guide us, and to your point, into justice, peace, love, and liberation. Yeah. And I might even say the healing that all of us need.
That's right.
Because post-enslavement, every black person should have had counseling.
But we didn't have no counselors back then.
Right.
We had a black preacher hooping on Sunday morning, making a shout.
You know what I'm saying?
That's
But and then we're wondering and wandering, trying to find our people, and deal with the trauma. But yet we are resilient, we're creative, we're innovative, because look what all we've done post-enslavement.
That's right.
And I feel like now we're slipping away from that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that has to do, we have become more tethered to, because I would say some of our ancestors, clear, like Ida Bell Wells Barnett, she wasn't tethered to no European way of thinking.
No. And some of that also breaches into...
I know we got to stop. Okay, go ahead.
And I got a meeting, but guess what? It's gotten so good. We're tearing in the Holy Ghost, as they would say.
Some of that, and I'm say this and walk away, I promise.
Okay.
Is that we have to also wrestle with how we view and perceive the Bible.
Right. Bibliology.
In a major sense.
Yeah.
Because...
the Bible is our idol.
As Mark Toulouse would say, exactly this.
Yeah.
In America, when people hold that Bible up, it's really idolatry.
I can do what it says I can do.
Right.
I can
have
be
what it says I can be.
I can have what it says I can have.
That's right.
I'm just saying.
That's right.
We made the Bible God.
And we're going to bring Dr. Timber Lewis back when we talk about that part of it, because she does an excellent job at unpacking the ways in which at SMU. And she was on our show earlier this season. She unpacked the African roots of Christianity in ways.
I always give credit to her for her helping me on that dissertation, that Cambridge dissertation.
Come on.
I always give my hat
That's
up
that
to- take my
mutuality.
hat
Sit
up.
down.
Absolutely.
That's the African mutuality.
She laid the
at work.
roots. All I had to do was just go and follow her map. No, absolutely. That's going to be good.
Listen, let's give it up for Pastor McGruder and Pastor Madison for being in the classroom
Great job,
today.
Good to be with you.
This was, a very rich conversation in which we definitely have to continue. Pastor Madison has to slide on out, but that's all good. He's already did his heavy lifting today, so we appreciate him. So listen, make sure that you share this episode. Make sure you tell people about this episode. Like us on Instagram. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And make sure you hit the notification bell to be alerted when we go live. And remember, we need your support. So make sure you buy your Fannie Lou Classroom t-shirt. We want to keep bringing you you saw what happened today. And you see who we bring every week. We try to make sure we bring the folks who can come in here and really have a conversation that we all can understand as a community. Because our goal in the classroom is to create a dynamic learning community where we're learning with each other, we're learning and growing to within the end of us really being able to live into the fullness that God has called us to live in. And a lot of that causes us to have to deconstruct what we know, what we have come to know, and reconstruct and rebuild something that really seeks to us to really achieve what Dr. King called the beloved community. And that can only happen when we have real justice, and that is right relationships with ourselves, with one another, and with systems and institutions. And that often requires us then to be activists, to engage in activism, and to be advocates. But moreover, it causes us to live out the mandate to do justice, love mercy, and walk wisely with our God. So be blessed, and we look forward to seeing you here for our final episode next week. You don't want to miss it, because part of the healing we talked about that needs to take place, Dr. Itahari Torre is going to talk to us in very practical terms and tell us the ways in which we can begin to heal as individuals and as a community. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for joining the classroom.
From the church house.